The late autumn sun beat down on Fort Clay, Texas, not with warmth, but with a dry, relentless insistence that baked the dust into Major Evelyn Reed's uniform. She stood on the edge of the parade ground, watching the truck convoy roll in. It was November 1945, and the world was supposed to be quiet now. But the only quiet Evie knew was the heavy, settling silence of disappointment. She had arrived back on American soil 2 weeks ago, a decorated officer from the European theater. Her work had been complex, demanding, and often terrifying, coordinating the supply lines and logistics for massive forward field hospitals, ensuring everything from penicillin to surgical gauze reached the front lines under constant threat. She had been responsible for saving hundreds of lives, a fact documented in the commendations now stitched quietly inside her coat. She was 32 years old, sharp as a tack, and ready for her next command, something worthy of her rank and her experience. What she received instead was Fort Clay, a post that felt less like a military base and more like a sun-baked outpost in the middle of nowhere. And what she received as an assignment was even worse. Her superior, Colonel Harlan Hastings, was a man whose uniform looked permanently tailored to convey a sense of self-importance that the war had never bothered to earn him. Hastings had spent the duration of the conflict comfortably stateside, shuffling papers and cultivating an impressive mustache. He was the kind of man who believed that a woman's place in the military was strictly advisory, administrative, and most certainly ornamental. Evie stood before his desk, her spine straight, her jaw set. The air in his office was thick with pipe smoke and stale resentment. "Major Reed," Hastings drawled, leaning back in his squeaky leather chair, the sound grating on Evie's nerves. "Welcome to Camp Unity." He made the name sound like a bad joke. "You should be proud. We've given you a real plum of a task." Evie looked down at the official order on his desk. The heading read, Commandant of Internal Affairs and Logistics, POW Camp Unity, Temporary Detention Center for High-Value Female German Personnel. "Sir," Evie said, her voice steady and professional, "with all due respect, I was hoping for a reassignment to Washington or perhaps to the Strategic Planning Division. My background in rapid logistical deployment—" Hastings cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand, a plume of smoke curling around his polished silver frame. "Your background, Major, is in managing supplies for mess halls and field hospitals. You've had a wonderful career, truly, coordinating the movement of beans and bandages. Very important, very domestic." The word domestic hit Evie like a slap. It stripped away every late night, every frantic phone call under shell fire, every impossible request she had somehow fulfilled. She knew this tone. She had faced it from men like him her entire career. They saw the woman first, the major second, and the efficiency never. "This, Evie," he continued, using her nickname with patronizing familiarity, "is perfect for you. You'll be in charge of the women's needs. Food, bedding, clothing, health. Think of it as running a very strict, very secure boarding house for our defeated Fräuleins. Logistical planning, Major Reed style." He let out a short, guttural laugh. "A glorified lunch lady, that's what we need." Evie kept her face expressionless, but the insult coiled tightly in her stomach. A glorified lunch lady. She had traded the potential for command and true strategic contribution for a job that boiled down, in Hastings' mind, to managing menus. "I understand the mandate, Colonel," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. "But I assure you, my professional capabilities extend far beyond the kitchen." "Of course they do, Major, but this camp is sensitive. High-value prisoners. We need a delicate touch, and we need someone who can follow the rules without making a fuss. The directive from Washington is clear: strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. No exceptions. They must be treated humanely." He paused, his tone shifting to a conspiratorial sneer. "But we don't have to like it, do we? This is America, Major. These women were the enemy." Evie's gaze finally flickered down to the dusty, sprawling camp outside the window. It was hastily constructed, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with concertina wire. It looked temporary, ugly, and unforgiving. Camp Unity. There was a cruel irony in that name. She thought of her brother, Daniel. He had been a medic, captured briefly by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. He had been starved, beaten, and kept in freezing conditions until the line was pushed forward. Daniel survived, but he came home a shadow of himself, haunted by the memory of the empty stomach and the cold. Evie's initial drive to serve was fueled by patriotism. Her drive now was fueled by a fierce, almost religious belief in the rules that defined civilized warfare, the rules that should have protected Daniel. She would follow the Geneva Convention, but not just because it was an order. She would follow it because it was a moral imperative, a sacred contract between nations, and the only thing that separated them from the enemy they had just defeated. She would follow it to the letter, even if it meant cooking steak for the very people who might have ordered her brother's torment. The first prisoners were due to arrive that afternoon. Evie dismissed herself, her salute sharp enough to make Hastings flinch slightly. As she walked out into the Texas heat, she pulled a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped a smudge of dust from her shoulder. A glorified lunch lady. Fine. If she was going to be a lunch lady, she would be the most professional, most meticulous, most rule-bound lunch lady the United States Army had ever seen. She would ensure the food was so perfectly aligned with Army regulations for high-value POWs that Hastings wouldn't have a single line item to object to, even if it meant serving them prime rib and cherry pie. The job was about logistics, not morality, but Evie knew that in a time of raw emotion and hatred, logistics, the strict, measured adherence to the law, was the highest form of morality. Evie immediately headed to the camp's supply depot, a corrugated metal shed already smelling of mildew and neglect. Her staff consisted of 3 enlisted men: Sergeant Miller, a young nervous cook who seemed more familiar with K rations than fresh ingredients; Corporal Jenkins, a bored-looking mechanic who clearly felt he was too good for this duty; and Private First Class Hayes, the only woman assigned to her detail, a quiet, efficient clerk who thankfully knew how to organize a spreadsheet. "Sergeant Miller," Evie snapped, her voice cutting through the sluggish air. "I need the requisition forms for the new intake. Specifics on food quality and quantity, according to the Geneva Convention addendum for officers." Miller, startled, fumbled with a stack of papers. "Ma'am, Colonel Hastings just sent a message. He said to just get them whatever's left over from the mess hall supplies. Said they're lucky to get that much." Evie took a deep, slow breath, counting to 10 in her head. Hastings was already testing her, undercutting her authority before the first prisoner had even stepped off the bus. "Sergeant," she said, her voice dropping to a low, firm register, "Colonel Hastings is responsible for the perimeter and security. I am responsible for internal affairs, which includes their welfare and supply. The directive comes from Washington. Read the document." She pointed to the sealed packet she carried, the official seal heavy and undeniable. "The convention stipulates that high-value detainees are to receive provisions equivalent in quality and quantity to the detaining force's own troops." She paused, looking him directly in the eye. "The American soldier eats well. Therefore the prisoners will eat well. We do not skimp. We do not use leftovers. If the rules say they get a fresh full ration, they get a fresh full ration. My order overrides any informal suggestion from the colonel." "Is that understood?" Sergeant Miller swallowed hard. "Understood, Major." "Good. Now what is the menu for this evening?" Miller shuffled the papers again. "Beans and reconstituted meatloaf, ma'am. That's what's scheduled for the general base personnel." Evie nodded. "The prisoners will not eat reconstituted meatloaf. That is a reserve ration, not a standard meal. Pull the necessary funds. We are purchasing fresh meat and vegetables for tonight. The quality must be acceptable. If the Army supply chain here is too slow or inadequate, we will source it locally. Corporal Jenkins, I need a list of local suppliers who can deliver fresh produce and meat on demand, starting immediately." Jenkins looked aghast. "Ma'am, we can't just go buying food on the local market." "That's not how the Army operates." "It is how my command operates when the official supply chain is insufficient to meet treaty obligations," Evie countered, tapping the document. "The money is budgeted for this. We are fulfilling the law. Start with the biggest rancher you can find outside of Harmony Creek. I want the highest quality available. I want it delivered by sundown. Go." As the men scrambled, Evie walked out to the main intake area. The buses were pulling up now. They were olive green, dusty, and bore the scars of a long journey. The heavy silence of the base seemed to press down on the scene. A small crowd of soldiers and a few curious civilian workers had gathered, their faces a mixture of resentment and grim satisfaction. They were here to watch the enemy arrive. The doors hissed open. Evie expected stern, goose-stepping automatons. She expected the cold, hard face of the Nazi machine. The stories and propaganda of the war had painted an image of fanatical, unyielding women. The next morning, Major Reed found herself locked in a bureaucratic war that felt far more frustrating than any of the logistical nightmares she had faced in Europe. Her opponent was, of course, Colonel Harlan Hastings, and the battleground was the integrity of her budget and, more importantly, the moral standing of the United States Army. Evie had spent half the night reading and rereading the Geneva Convention addendum, specifically the section detailing the treatment of captured commissioned officers. The language was meticulously specific, designed to prevent the very abuses that had defined the conflict in other theaters. The food rations of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to those of the detaining powers' troops in base camps. It was a crystal-clear mandate. Not similar, not acceptable, but equivalent. Hastings summoned her to his office at 0700 hours, before the sun had fully burned off the early morning mist. He was seated behind his desk, flanked by two other officers who looked equally stateside and smug. "Major Reed," Hastings began, his voice laced with the barely concealed pleasure of a man about to deliver a chastisement. "I received your requisition for the prisoner mess hall. I have to say I am utterly astonished." Evie stood at rigid attention. "Sir, you have requested a budget increase of nearly 300% for their dietary needs. You want fresh beef? You want daily fresh produce. You want a rotating menu that frankly sounds better than what my own staff is eating. You even requisitioned butter, Major Butter, when we have plenty of margarine." He scoffed, looking at the officers beside him, who obediently chuckled. "I believe I have misheard," Hastings continued, dripping sarcasm. "Did you mistake your assignment for running a spa, Major, or did you genuinely believe it was your job to cater a lavish dinner party for the defeated enemy?" Evie did not move a muscle. She looked straight ahead, addressing the core of the insult. "Colonel, my job is to uphold the law as dictated by the Department of War and international treaty. The language of the treaty is non-negotiable. I am ensuring strict adherence to the Geneva Convention's requirements for officer-level POWs. She reached into her breast pocket and produced a carefully marked, highlighted copy of the relevant passage. "The convention states, sir, that their rations must be equivalent to our own base troops. Our base troops, according to Regulation 3.4, are entitled to high-quality protein and a specified caloric intake, which, when translated to civilian purchasing power, mandates the purchase of fresh foodstuffs, including meat." "Balderdash, Major!" Hastings slammed his hand on the desk, startling the other officers. "They are enemy officers! They are Nazis! We just fought a bloody war to defeat them, and you're talking about giving them a 4-star meal. It's an insult to every American boy who starved in a German camp." Evie finally allowed her voice to rise slightly, giving it the hard, commanding edge she reserved for crisis situations. "Sir, I understand the emotional context. I lost a family member to the enemy. But our national honor is not based on emotion. It is based on law. If we descend to their level of cruelty, we have invalidated everything we fought for. I am not debating morality, Colonel. I am stating fact. The funds are legally available for this expenditure under the International Treaty Compliance header. Denying this requisition puts you in direct violation of a War Department mandate, which I am prepared to report up the chain of command immediately." The room went silent. Hastings glared at her, his face flushing crimson. He hadn't expected her to be so fiercely prepared, or so willing to draw the line in the sand over something as seemingly small as a food budget. Most officers, especially women officers of that era, would have backed down, fearing career suicide. But Evie had already been insulted. She had nothing left to lose but her professional integrity. The two other officers suddenly found the ceiling fascinating, avoiding eye contact. Evie knew she had him cornered. He could not openly violate a treaty and a direct order from Washington. "Very well, Major Reed," Hastings hissed, picking up the requisition form and signing it with a savage scratch of his pen. The money is authorized. But let me be perfectly clear. I am watching every nickel. And the men, Major, my men are not happy that you're treating the enemy better than they treat themselves. Evie saluted sharply. The Army will always follow its own rules, Colonel. Good day, sir. She walked out knowing she had won the battle. But the war for respect, both for herself and for the law, was far from over. The hostility she felt from Hastings was mirrored in the town of Harmony Creek. The news of a German POW camp and a women's camp at that had spread like wildfire. The locals were fiercely patriotic, having sacrificed sons and daughters to the war effort. They were not ready for peace or forgiveness. As Corporal Jenkins drove the Army truck into town that afternoon, attempting to source the high-quality supplies, they were met with open resentment. A small group of women holding signs, "No steak for Nazis!" and "Feed Americans First," stood outside the general store. A few men spat on the ground as the military vehicle passed. Jenkins, nervous, turned to Evie, who was riding shotgun. "Major, maybe we should just use the base supplies." "This isn't worth the trouble," Evie shook her head. "No, Corporal. That is exactly what they want. We do not let local sentiment dictate federal law. We need to find Mr. Samuel Vance, the rancher you mentioned. He runs a high-quality operation, doesn't he?" "Yes, ma'am." "Vance is known for the best beef in the entire county, but he's notoriously stubborn. Only deals with high-end buyers in Dallas and Houston. Might not even talk to us." Evie knew she had to convince Vance. The base supply depot, as she discovered, was hopelessly inadequate, a consequence of Hastings's deliberate neglect. The meat was freezer-burned, the vegetables wilted. Using that for the POWs would be a direct violation of the equivalent quality clause. Evie needed the best to satisfy the letter of the law. They drove out of the dusty town and onto a vast, sprawling property. The air immediately smelled cleaner, of fresh hay and open land. Vance Ranch was a fortress of Texas pride, large, well-maintained fences, heavy gates, and a sprawling, low-slung ranch house built of native stone. Samuel Vance was a man carved from the same hard land he worked. He was in his 60s, weathered, with eyes that squinted against the sun and sized up everything they looked at. He met Evie in his boots and a wide-brimmed hat, leaning against the fender of a worn-out pickup. "You're the Army lady who wants to buy my best beef for the government," Vance stated, not as a question, but as an observation. "Major Evelyn Reed, Mr. Vance." "And yes, sir, I am. I need a contract for daily delivery of high-quality, grade-A beef and fresh produce starting immediately." Vance chewed thoughtfully on a piece of straw. "Major, I don't deal with the government. Too much paperwork, too many delays, and the checks bounce higher than a Bronco." "My checks will not bounce." "Mr. Vance, I have the requisition signed by Colonel Hastings, and the funds are authorized for immediate transfer. I will pay your top market rate in cash if necessary, and I guarantee you a long-term contract if the quality is maintained." Evie knew she was bending the rules on the cash payment, but she had to establish trust. Vance narrowed his eyes. "You're buying this for those German women, aren't you? The ones out at Camp Unity?" Evie met his gaze, unflinching. "I am buying this to fulfill the obligations of the United States government, Mr. Vance. The rules state they must be fed to the same standards as American troops. I intend to follow that rule exactly. My mission is not to judge the enemy, but to uphold the honor of my country by maintaining the law. I will not have my command accused of violating an international treaty." Vance remained silent for a long moment, studying her face. He saw not a soft lunch lady, but a determined officer who valued law over convenience. He'd seen plenty of soft-handed officers who wouldn't stick their necks out for a principle. Finally, he spat the straw onto the ground. "My boy, Billy, he was in the 101st Airborne. Saw the worst of it. Got hit at Bastogne. He made it home, but he's not the same. So feeding these people? It doesn't sit right with me, Major." "I understand, sir," Evie said softly. "I assure you I understand that pain. But what your boy fought for was a country that honors its word, even to the people who tried to destroy it. If we compromise on our standards, then every sacrifice, every principle becomes meaningless." I need your help, Mr. Vance, to ensure America remains the honorable party in this peace. It's not about their comfort. It's about our integrity." Vance looked out over his fields. "Integrity," he repeated, testing the word. "It's been a long time since I heard an officer talk about that. All right, Major Reed, I like the way you talk. I'll give you a truckload of my best. It'll be better than anything the Army base gets. I'll make sure your German guests get the finest Texas beef I can raise. Because if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. But don't expect a discount. And you handle the paperwork, Major. I hate paperwork." Evie felt a surge of professional relief. "Deal, Mr. Vance. The first delivery is required by 1600 hours today." As they drove back, Evie knew she had secured the necessary supplies, but her open defiance of Hastings and her public procurement of premium food had deepened the well of resentment. She was now a marked woman, both by her commanding officer and by the local community, but she had the law on her. The air in the makeshift kitchen at Camp Unity was thick with anticipation and the rich, unmistakable scent of grilling beef. Evie stood by the large institutional stove, watching Sergeant Miller, his nervousness from the day before replaced by a focused, professional concentration. "Sergeant," Evie instructed, her hands clasped behind her back, "I want the steaks cooked medium. We are not serving shoe leather. The rule is equivalence. The American soldier at this base eats a decent meal. The prisoners will eat a decent meal. Ensure the seasoning is correct. Simple salt and pepper. No need for anything fancy. But the taste must be clean and satisfying." The delivery from Samuel Vance had been, as promised, outstanding. It wasn't just beef. It was the kind of thick-cut, well-marbled sirloin that melted in the mouth. Evie also had fresh-dug potatoes and plump, bright green beans. It was a meal that screamed quality and expense. The cost was astronomical. But Evie had ensured every receipt, every log entry, and every single line item was perfectly in order. Anticipating Hastings' inevitable scrutiny, she was making it impossible for him to question the legality of the purchase, forcing him to only question the morality, which was a fight Evie was prepared to win. Meanwhile, the 20 German women POWs were gathered in their small, partitioned dining hall. They sat at plain wooden tables, their cleaned-up uniforms still a bit ill-fitting, but their posture still rigid. They had been given the meager, standard base rations for their first evening, the reconstituted meatloaf and wilted vegetables that Hastings had originally insisted upon. They had eaten it in silence, clearly accustomed to far worse, but offering no thanks or complaint. They were survivors practicing the stoicism of the defeated. Captain Ingrid Miller sat at the head of one table, her eyes constantly observing. She had been a logistics officer in the Luftwaffe, sharp and highly intelligent. She knew that American policy, in theory, mandated humane treatment, but she also knew the reality of war and hatred. She expected the good treatment to last only until the initial inspection was over, after which they would be subjected to the typical deprivations of prison life. She was waiting for the trap. The door to the mess hall swung open and Major Evelyn Reed walked in. She was flanked by Sergeant Miller and Corporal Jenkins, both carrying heavy trays. The two men looked nervous, acutely aware of the precious cargo they were carrying and the eyes watching them. Evie halted in the middle of the room. The scent of the food hit the German women first, a deep, savory, smoky aroma that their wartime-starved senses barely recognized. It wasn't the smell of thin soup, boiled cabbage, or ersatz coffee. It was the scent of plenty, of real high-quality cooking. Ingrid Muller watched Evie's face. The American major was not smiling, not gloating, and not showing a single trace of pity. She looked like a professional soldier completing a task. Sergeant Miller and Corporal Jenkins began placing the plates down in front of each woman. On each plate rested a magnificent piece of steak, perfectly seared on the outside, a deep pink red in the center. It was flanked by a generous scoop of creamy mashed potatoes and a side of glistening green beans. A collective, soft gasp went through the room. It was not a sound of happiness, but of utter, disbelieving shock. They stared at the plates as if the food were a highly volatile explosive. Many of them hadn't seen a piece of fresh meat this size since before the war started, 3, 4, 5 years ago. They had lived on rations, on dried substitutes, on whatever could be scrounged. Steak, a thick, rich cut of Texas sirloin, was a fantasy. One young woman, a former communications clerk, started to cry silently, her tears splashing onto the pristine white of the mashed potatoes. She wasn't crying from happiness, but from the unbearable, disorienting shock of having the expectation of cruelty replaced by this overwhelming, unexpected bounty. Ingrid Muller did not move, but her mind raced. This was a test. They were poisoning them. They were fattening them up for some sort of public display. This was American mockery, a deliberate attempt to break their spirit with the sheer contrast to their defeat and starvation. It could not be real. She looked at Evie, her eyes hard and challenging. "Major Reed," she finally said, her German-accented English perfectly clear and strong. "What is this? Is this some kind of sick joke?" Evie stepped closer to her table, her boots clicking on the wooden floor. She remained perfectly composed. "Captain Muller, this is your dinner," Evie stated. "It is grade A beef, fresh from a Texas rancher with potatoes and green vegetables. As I explained yesterday, your rations are equivalent in quality and quantity to the United States troops' rations. This is today's troop meal." She paused, letting the power of her simple, unembellished truth sink in. "The United States Army does not practice sick jokes, Captain. We practice the law. You are officers, and you are entitled to this under the terms of the treaty. My job is to ensure that my country upholds its honor, regardless of who is seated at this table. Eat your meal. Your cooperation in this process is required." She turned to the entire group. "You are not being poisoned. You are not being mocked. You are being treated according to the laws of war, enforced by Major Reed and my staff. You may now eat." Evie gave a sharp nod to Sergeant Miller, then turned and walked out of the room, leaving the German women alone with their impossible meal. She didn't wait for them to take the first bite. Her job was to enforce the law, not to seek their gratitude or watch their reaction. As the door closed, silence hung in the air for a few more beats. Then, one by one, hesitantly, the women picked up their forks. Ingrid Muller, the most defiant, was the first to cut into the meat. It was tender. She brought a small piece to her mouth, chewing slowly, cautiously. The taste was overwhelming, rich, salty, and utterly real. It tasted of a world they thought they had lost forever. She looked at the other women, her expression unreadable. This wasn't a joke. This was real. Evie, back in her small Spartan office, sat down heavily in her chair. She had done it. She had forced Hastings's hand, battled local sentiment, secured the finest meal, and delivered it exactly as the law required. The professional satisfaction was immense, but it was quickly overshadowed by a new, more immediate problem. Private First Class Hayes, her quiet, efficient clerk, knocked softly and entered the office. Her face was pale. "Major," Hayes whispered, closing the door behind her. I have a problem, Major. During the final health check, one of the prisoners, a woman named Frau Greta Schmidt, she collapsed in the washing room. I got her back to her bunk, but she's not good, Major. Not good at all." "What is her status?" "Did the initial medical check miss something?" Evie demanded, rising instantly. "The check noted severe malnutrition, Major, but this is more. She has a terrible cough and there's blood, Major. Not a lot, but I saw it on her handkerchief." Hayes's voice was shaking. "Captain Muller and the others are trying to keep it quiet. They are hiding her, trying to manage it themselves. They won't ask for help." Evie's mind raced. Tuberculosis, or something equally infectious and life-threatening. If true, Greta Schmidt needed immediate hospitalization, isolation, and specialist care. And her being hidden by the other POWs meant they distrusted the American military health system completely. Their expectation of cruelty was still deeper than the sight of steak. If Evie followed the protocol now, she would have to isolate Schmidt in the base hospital, which was run by Hastings' chief medical officer, a man known for his anti-German bias. Evie knew that equivalent treatment at the base hospital would likely translate to neglect and basic quarantine until the woman either recovered or died. But if she did not follow the protocol, she would be breaking the chain of command, removing a high-value prisoner from military custody and risking a court-martial. This was no longer about a budget or a dinner menu. This was about a human life and a professional gamble that could cost Evie her entire career. She looked at PFC Hayes. "Did anyone else see this, Private?" "No, Major, just me. Captain Miller swore me to silence, but I couldn't, Major. She's dying." Evie straightened her uniform, her expression hard with professional duty, but her heart beginning to pound with the enormous moral choice ahead. She thought of Daniel again, suffering in a prison cell. The law required her to provide equivalent care. A dying American soldier would be taken to the best possible facility for a life-saving procedure. She needed to do the same. And the best possible facility was not Fort Clay. "Private Hayes," Evie said, her voice dropping to a whisper, a stark contrast to her earlier commanding tone. "I want you to get me a discreet, unmarked vehicle. I want you to find me the closest, most reliable civilian hospital outside of military jurisdiction. We are breaking the rules, Private. We are going to save this woman's life, and we are going to do it in absolute secrecy. This stays between us." The fate of a German life was now a test of Major Evelyn Reed's courage, her compassion, and her willingness to sacrifice everything she had earned. The stake had shocked them into confusion. The next move would either earn their grudging respect or ruin her forever.